Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for that kind introduction, Norman. And it's a pleasure to have you at the Capitol. And there are some days that we don't know what we'd do without your support and your help on the many things that we're fighting for. Most of you are probably pretty familiar with critical race theory. You've heard of critical race theory, right? I'd like to talk a little bit about that, talk about action civics, or what's also called protest civics, and really focus on what does this mean for South Dakota. So what is critical race theory? James Lindsay defines it succinctly as the belief that all society is organized by race. That's it. He also says it's a strategy to obliterate our way of life. Some of you have seen Liz Wheeler on YouTube. She says, it's not anti-discrimination training, contrary to what Chris Wallace says. It's the latest tool used by the radical left to transform the United States into a socialist, Marxist disaster. So we didn't really start hearing about critical race theory until recently, but its origins are not new. Critical race theory is rooted in what's called critical theory, and that was actually birthed in 1937 at the Frankfurt School in Germany. The director there published a piece called Traditional and Critical Theory, and what he claimed was there is no such thing as universal truth. You've heard that before, right? And no person can be objective. And so CRT, critical race theory, is an offshoot of that, claiming that everything can be reduced to race. And it emerged actually as its own theory in the 1990s as an academic discipline based on identity-based Marxism. So typically Marxism is more of a class cultural theory where you have the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, and you have the have and the have-nots. Well, that didn't work in America. So they found a way to capitalize on some of the things that were going on in the 60s, and then this emerged as a theory that's really based on race and identity. So critical race theory asserts a number of things. It asserts that white people are inherently racist, and if you think you're not racist, you're probably more racist, they would say, because you are implicitly biased. So this leads to the silencing of people and self-censorship. They don't even feel like they can speak. They would also say that America, since it was founded by white men, is fundamentally racist. It relies on the premise that white people only give to black people and give them opportunities and freedoms when it's also in their own best interest. Therefore, they don't trust any attempt to make racism better. So you can see how this is all self-perpetuating for critical race theorists. And they reject all potential alternatives like colorblindness as forms of racism, making themselves the only allowable game in town, which is really totalitarianism. They would say that all of our institutions are fundamentally racist, that racism is present in every aspect of life, every relationship, every interaction, and therefore the advocates look for it everywhere. They would also say that our systems of government, economics, criminal justice are illegitimate. So what they want to do is they want to tear down those systems so that they can impose Marxism. Critical race theory is against free societies, and it wants to dismantle them and replace them with something that advocates control. Another critical thing about critical race theory is that it treats people as groups, not as individuals. So there's no individuality in critical race theory. Your identity is you're part of a group. And because CRT cannot be satisfied, it becomes kind of an activist black hole, and it threatens to destroy everything it's introduced to. That's just a little bit about CRT, which you probably are familiar with a lot of that. So what we're finding is that without us really even knowing, that critical race theory is being embedded and has been embedded, and it's infiltrated any number of institutions in our society. It's taught to children in schools, and maybe even worse yet, it's taught to teachers who are in the universities becoming teachers. And so then it's like embedded in how they teach. So they get out teaching and they don't even know what they're doing. They just think that this is how they were taught. That's the way you teach. It's also in, they would say, most law schools in the country. It's been injected into government agencies, corporate human resource departments. And if you want to get a glimpse of really how embedded this is, especially in universities and some K-12, you can go to a website called WOKISouthDakotaWordPress.com. If you want to write it down, it's WOKISD.wordpress.com. That'll give you a really good feel for exactly how prevalent it is in South Dakota. So the other way that they infiltrate with critical race theory is they use language and programs that include buzzwords like equity, which for a long time we kind of confused that with equality and thought that was a good thing. James Lindsay describes equity as race communism. So equity is not equality of opportunity, which is what we believe in. It's equality of outcome. So it really is race communism. They also use words like social justice, diversity and inclusion, not in the way we would use those, but in a political way with an agenda behind it. They also call it DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion. They use the words culturally responsive, and they're teaching and programming kids in all of this. So I have a handout here that I'm just going to make available to Norman, and he can put it on the website, but just some of their critical terms, and they co-opt a lot of our language. So social justice, you've probably heard of that. Critical race theory, diversity, again, not in the way that we would define diversity. They use the word equity, implicit bias, decolonization, racial justice, cultural competence or relevance. One of the things we hear around here a lot is cultural responsiveness. You've probably even seen headlines with that, like how are we going to make sure our schools are culturally responsive? And they sound like those would be good things, but the agenda behind those things is what's problematic. They talk about inclusion. They use discrimination, some differently than we would use it. So what is protest civics, action civics? It's teaching civics in a way that encourages or requires activism. It's basically a way to get CRT into the schools and have it just become a part of who the kids are and how they operate. It's known as an inquiry-based methodology as opposed to a content-based methodology. It's constructivism versus objectivism. And it leads students to social justice activism without the full understanding of the issues, history, and content. They'll talk about it as civic engagement. That doesn't sound like a bad thing, but the way they're going about it is not the way that we would want our children to go about it. We want our children to have the full knowledge of our founding, our documents, our founders, and understand why our founders did what they did when they declared independence and declared the revolution. They go about it differently. So the critical race theory and protest civics are ushered into our schools with what's called, largely, in most schools, it's done with what's called the C3 framework. And there's an article by David Randall of the National Association of Scholars, and he calls, this is just a great categorization of the C3 framework. And it was used in our social studies standards this last summer. He calls the C3 framework learning how to think about nothing. And he tells exactly what it does. It's a method for constructing standards that substitutes process for content. And it focuses on skills. And they use the buzzword inquiry, but not in the same way we would do it. It's more of that constructivism, that you just let the kids inquire about what they might want to do, and then they can do a project about it, and then it leads them to some sort of activism. The C3 framework compounds the decline of student knowledge because it further limits the time that is spent on content instruction, and it requires more time on process instruction. And the content is only justified if it supports the C3 framework process instruction. So what it does is it leads some to believe especially those who are instructing children, that certain content, because content is not the most important, it's process, that certain content would be optional, say the Declaration of Independence, or the Constitution, or studying the founding time period. That's all optional because it's not the content that's important, it's the process, according to the C3 framework. The C3 framework also misunderstands the point of school instruction. They get it backwards. You don't have children read the Declaration of Independence to learn source evaluation skills. You teach them source evaluation skills so that they can more deeply appreciate the Declaration of Independence. One thing that you'll all appreciate is that this is linked, well, you won't appreciate it, but you'll understand it. This is linked to, the C3 framework is linked to Common Core, and it's linking the social studies standards to the failed Common Core standards. So David Randall says that there's no state that can adopt the C3 framework without committing itself to rigid constraints on what facts can be taught. So basically, you're committing ahead of time when you use this framework because it constrains you in terms of teaching facts. He says that no state can adopt the C3 framework without committing itself to the disdain of the primary importance of teaching and learning factual knowledge because it's about process. He says that no state can adopt the C3 framework without regarding the Declaration of Independence as nothing more than an interchangeable prompt for social studies. Just like what I talked about, it's optional because it's a process that's important. In addition, the C3 framework politicalizes social studies curricula based on the standards. It commits social studies to instruction in multicultural and global understandings, the ability to work with diverse groups, which solidifies instruction in multiculturalism and diversity. And again, not in the way we would define those words, but in the way the left defines those words according to their political agenda. Another thing that they're big on is trying to redefine how we talk about America. They want to talk about America as a democracy. We're a republic. We may be a democratic republic or a constitutional republic or some combination of that, but we are a republic. And one of their big strategies is to replace democracy with republic every time they can. We fought that a lot with the standards. The C3 framework substitutes the loyalty to our republic, the Constitution, and our laws with loyalty to communities and societies. And it imparts an unsettling totalitarian impulse to the activity of government. It also subordinates all social studies instruction to action civics, known as civic engagement or protest civics. It distorts what civic participation is, and it defines how the United States, it defines both by how it defines the United States and the nature of civic engagement. The other interesting thing is we talk about civic virtue, and character instruction in civic virtue, according to the C3 framework, leads to civic engagement. It's not about who you are as a person and how you are as a citizen. It's basically about how much protest you'll do or what kind of activism you'll commit to and then go do. They talk about research, and they talk about community-based research, which is really advocacy research to achieve a policy goal. It's not disengaged research that students should be doing at school. They say civic instruction is not just preparation for informed action, but it includes informed action. So oftentimes there's encouragement and even requirement as a part of class requirements that students will participate in certain civic activity. As you can see, it actually possesses all the attributes of community organizing. So what does this mean for South Dakota? This last summer, we had the Social Studies Standards Revision process. And those standards, we have those kind of standards for every subject area. They're revised every 7 years, and they, on a rotating basis. And those standards set the minimum for what students should know in those subjects throughout K-12. It sets the outline for curriculum, and the committee that was selected for the social studies revision was a committee made up mostly of K-12 teachers. There were a couple legislators. I was one from the House. There was a senator as well, And there were a couple business people, medical professionals, but mostly teachers. So part of what they do is there's sort of this thought process on the part of the people who are participating in this, that they'll go to peer and they'll really have a chance to help write the standards and make a difference and bring good perspective to what the kids are learning. Well, what we learned very quickly is there was a meeting before the meeting, before we got there. They had this last summer, like the summer before, so in 2020. And they developed what they called an unpacked document based on the prior standards. So they put a lot of detail to what had been there before and tried to set the stage then for what would happen next time. They also decided that those of us on the committee should go through a training on the C3 framework, which is the framework that I just told you about that's so horrible. So in May, 50 committee members had 5 one-hour Zoom meetings once a week on the C3 framework to train us on the C3 framework. And then we spent 10 days in June supposedly revising the standards. What we didn't know until a little bit later, until we basically got there, was that the South Dakota Department of Education had contracted with the American Institute for Research and a person named Beth Ratway to facilitate the in-person meetings. So then we created the revised standards. The consultant compiled them and presented them to the South Dakota Department of Education. Now you've heard a little bit of controversy on those, on the standards that the group presented. And I was one of maybe 3 or 4 conservatives in the whole group of 50. And so I was in the minority and pretty much outvoted. So what's in the standards is mostly not anything that I would agree with. So even though the Department of Education was part of the entire process of facilitating this leader and paying her a hefty sum of money, once they got her work product from the group, I think because of some political pressure, they actually revised the standards that the work group did. And they took out some of the action civics and some of the other things that they thought they would get criticism on. And those actually were positive changes. They're getting criticized for them right now, and there's even a protest in peer. So right now the standards are in the public comment stage, and there will be 4 public hearings when those standards are then voted on, probably in January, by the Board of Education Standards. And if they're approved by the Board of Education Standards, the standards will take effect the fall of 2023. One critical piece is they've made the standards a lot more vague. They've taken out some of the things that people would notice as action civics, but it's still built on an action civics framework. So what they do then the following summer with a different group of people is they have what they call an unpacking session. That's where they put really the meat to the bones on these standards. The standards are pretty vague, and that's where they can bring in a lot of the action civics. Under the radar, that unpacking is not approved by the Board of Education Standards or the governor or the legislature. So those then they just go out to the schools as resources for teachers to use. So that's something we want to keep a really close eye on. So are critical race theory and action civics in South Dakota? Is a question. There was an article by Stanley Kurtz of the National Review in May of 2021. Let me just read you what he says. And what he's talking about is the unpacked documents that they did on the past standards, which is what we're concerned about what they'll do this next time. So he says, so let's have a look at Action Civics South Dakota style. Consider the exercise comparing soft civic action to critical civic action. The word critical is a tip-off to the neo-Marxist perspective. As in CRT, critical legal studies, etc., students are asked to evaluate their impact of volunteer activities, say a food drive. So the students must ask if food drives really solve the problem of being unable to afford food. They're doing all of this instead of learning about the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, right? That's the inquiry method. They're asked to decide if that's really a problem and if volunteerism really solves it. So after students are shown the limits of volunteerism, they're introduced to the superior idea of critical civic action, which really is the sort of politics that would permanently solve poverty, according to the left. There are also exercises in our Unpacked documents, according to Stanley Kurtz, that are almost designed to turn students against the Electoral College and supported the admission of Washington, D.C. and Puerto Rico as states. And he says, what a coincidence. These just happen to be the major planks of the far left wing of today's Democratic Party. That's in South Dakota documents. We're a red state. Students are also urged to participate in a dialogue as global citizens. This is the very antithesis of the 1776 Action Candidate Pledge, which calls on schools to cultivate a sense that Americans are members of a national community united by our founding principles. The Unpacked South Dakota Social Studies Standards repeatedly call for the creation of a class position statement to tell students to advocate for legislation as a class. Kurtz goes on to say, this epitomizes the problem of action civics between teacher bias, peer pressure, and the machinations of the leftist nonprofit groups who generously help students with their action civics projects. Conservative students end up being intimidated and silenced by class-wide political projects. Who wants to be left out of all that fun? This is one of the reasons why public schools need to stay nonpartisan and reject action civics. He says the leftist bias of most activities in the standards is patent. Students are supposed to raise awareness of how minority groups face bias in the mainstream media. So this is mainstream media bias. And he says, what universe are South Dakota's education bureaucrats living in? Students are also told to create a press release defending membership of the United States in a specific international organization. Any idea which that one is? Students are also charged with studying global warming and then debating whether there are civic responsibilities related to this issue. Talk about a stacked debate. I could go on, but you get the idea. Kurtz writes. You won't find that in the standards. They're very vague. The standards are vague, and those types of things are buried if they're there, but they bring them in what they call the unpacking, which is the dangerous part next summer. So on May 4th, the governor signed the 1776 pledge, which is a fabulous pledge. I'm going to read you part of it here. You're probably familiar with it. I think I'm going to read you part of it. Here it is. Okay, so this pledge says, the United States of America is an exceptional nation whose people have always strived to form a more perfect union based upon our founding principles. Our founding fathers, as well as leaders, Abraham Lincoln, Frederick Douglass, Reverend Martin Luther King, were among the greatest Americans to ever live, and they deserve to be honored as heroes. Our children and grandchildren should be taught to take pride in their country, to respect our founding. Civics education should focus on the serious study of founding documents, not coerce students into engaging in extracurricular political action on behalf of contemporary political positions. Our young people should be taught to view one another not according to race or gender, but as individuals made in the image of God. Teaching children to hate their country and each other is immoral and deeply harmful to our society and must be stopped. I totally agree with this pledge. I actually signed this pledge as well. This is a fabulous pledge on behalf of the governor. So then candidates will sign this pledge if they believe it. I therefore pledge that I will restore honest patriotic education that cultivates our children a profound love of our country, promote curriculum that teaches that all children are created equal, have equal moral value under God, our Constitution, and the law, and are members of a national community united by our founding principles. They pledge to prohibit any curriculum that pits students against one another on the basis of race or sex, and they pledge to prevent schools from politicizing education by prohibiting any curriculum that requires students to protest and lobby during or after school. So this is a fabulous pledge. But as you heard what I just said about these unpacked documents, these standards, it's completely contrary to what the governor has said she wants. And I think what most South Dakotans would want. I think South Dakotans in general believe this. So while the governor says she doesn't want CRT and Action Civics in South Dakota, meanwhile, her Department of Education has fully embraced the model and methodology that embeds it in all of K-12 education. So this pledge was on May 4th, and on May 20th, The social studies specialist who reports to the Secretary of Education in South Dakota signed a contract committing $250,000 of our taxpayer money to a social justice warrior, a known social justice warrior and ideologue, to lead the South Dakota social studies revision process. This person could not be any more diametrically opposed to the governor's stand on Inter 1776 pledge. So a little bit about what I experienced in that revision process. It was very obvious that the train had left the station before we got to Pier. They had a meeting before the meeting and the path was set. We didn't have any input into the methodology. We did not do a detailed review of the 2015 standards or any other options to determine the best path forward. There was lip service that was given to openness and hearing all ideas, but if you had a different opinion, you were quickly intimidated and shut down. They used a process which I came to call forced consensus. They gave us these little cards. I found them in my briefcase later. I don't know why I even kept them. I just threw them in there, I think, when we were done. But you'll see there's a green card, and a red card, and a yellow card. And so on anything that the group was discussing, if you were in favor of it, you voted green. If you weren't so sure, here's what this says on the back of the yellow card, which is kind of interesting. I have reservations about this recommendation. It's not perfect, but I can live with it and support its implementation. So basically they're saying, yeah, you might have concerns about it, but you just sit back and agree that you're not going to oppose it, right? And then the red one says, I object to this recommendation. It does not serve the best interests of our state at this time. So they would oftentimes bring up votes on things quickly when we didn't know what we were voting on, and it wasn't a linear process or by a very cohesive agenda. It was a spiral type of thing, and if they encountered resistance, they left it alone. And then they said, well, we'll come back to that later. And oftentimes then they would get into a bigger group of people and then have more people around the circle trying to intimidate the one person who voted red to change their vote. They kept telling me, well, we got to get you to red. I mean, we got to get you from red to green. I said, you're not going to get me from red to green on this. And they're like, but we all have to agree. And I said, you know, I'm familiar with the process we use in the legislature, which is majority rules, minority rights. So we may not agree, but everyone still has the right to vote the way they want to vote, and then they understand that the majority rules. They did not like that. They did not want any dissent at all. They wanted it squashed, so that if there was any question at all, by the Board of Education standards, the public, parents, anyone, the press, they could say, well, this whole group of 50 people agreed. 100% consensus. Everybody was on board. So then it intimidates parents into thinking, well, you know, maybe they don't know what they're talking about. It's a whole process. They did not know what to do with me. So the things we fought for were to restore the founding time period into U.S. history. We were not initially successful with that. They did add a little bit back. There are 19 U.S. history standards, and they added a mention of it in one. What their goal is they're saying they don't want to teach the founding in high school because they can't really ever get to the last 5 decades. But my argument is the last 5 decades don't matter if you don't have the founding. The last 5 decades don't exist if you don't have the founding. Exactly. They didn't like that either. So they also had the founding documents in what they called an anchor standard, which is like a primary standard. And they wanted to take those out, and I objected. And they said, that was one of those red votes, and they said, well, we'll put them in like the grade level standards then. I said, no, it needs to be in the primary standards. Well, they ended up putting it in the grade level standards. So what they do is they try to rid themselves of criticism if anybody looks at these, then they'll say, oh, well, the Constitution is mentioned here, the Constitution is in here. Well, what people don't know is how they changed it, what it used to look like. And even the 2015 standards as far as civics, I think are better than the proposed revisions, but even the 2015 standards are flawed. Especially if you look at like 2003 standards from Massachusetts. We'll talk a little bit about that. So I also questioned the framework, and I did that on one of those video conferences, and they ganged up on me on that too. And one of the members of our group saw the standard that said students should know the effect of religion on Western political thought. And she immediately said, well, that has no place here, that needs to be gone. I said, nope, I'm a red on that. So they put some little standard in there that said something about religious ideas and political philosophies or something like that, which really watered that down completely. But since I signed the 1776 pledge, and even more than that, just based on my own principles, I couldn't in good conscience be a part of the final document. And I didn't know what the final document would look like, because everybody turned in bits and pieces, and this consultant was supposed to compile them. I had no idea what that would look like. I didn't want my name on them. So, and I had voted no on nearly half of the content of the proposed standards. So, I resigned. I went through the whole process because I wanted to be there as the whole thing unfolded. But then the last day, I resigned so that my name would not be on the standards. And I'll tell you, even if the content was 100% perfect, they're still in violation of the 1776 pledge because they're built on an action civics framework, that C3 framework. So along with me, one of my colleagues also resigned. He's a retired orthodontist from Rapid City. Let me just read you a little bit, and he says it's okay to share this, of why he resigned. He says, I feel strongly that our graduates need to know how and why our great country was founded in the manner it was if they're to become active and responsible citizens. All our history is important, but our founding is our foundation, and by far the most important. Teaching it in the 5th and 8th grades is simply not adequate. And then he goes on to say, interestingly, as I was discussing including our founding in high school with our table group, so we were grouped by tables based on our topic. He was history, I was civics. The group leader was kind of hesitant, and she said, I should say something, but I won't. And then he repeated his request that the founding be included in the standards, and she just kind of lost it. And she said, I don't want to talk or teach about a bunch of old white guys who didn't include an Indian or a black. That's why I won't teach it. This is a U.S. history teacher from Chamberlain, South Dakota. This is a real South Dakota person. A lot of them who were there felt the same way. They just weren't as blatant about it. She just sort of lost it. And there were people who heard it, and he's documented it in his resignation. So how do we fix this, really is the question, right? I don't want to leave you with all the bad news. The good news is we can fix it. First of all, the current standard process needs to be completely scrapped. You can't fix these things because they're based on the wrong framework. And at some point, it will allow some other group to come in and do the same thing that they did with the past standards, unpack them in a way that we don't like. So we need to start over with a new foundation. The process needs to be managed by people who will not institute this inquiry-based learning and focus on good content. The standards should be vetted by individuals who are experts in their areas. And a good example of that, as I mentioned before, is Massachusetts. If you just Google 2003 Massachusetts social studies standards, you'll find them. But I'll show you, they're 100 pages long, full of rich content in very small print. If any of you want to come look at this, you can at some point. But you can see this is really small print. This is 100 pages worth of civic standards, well, social studies standards. You look at ours, and ours are about 28 pages with lots of charts and colors and all sorts of things. I just found you to show you the copy of ours. This is our proposed. And you can see there's really not the content. It's charts and graphs and that kind of thing. So if you do a side-by-side comparison, you'll see really, really good standards from Massachusetts and really poor ones from ours. Sandra Stotsky was very instrumental in the success of Massachusetts standards, English language standards, as well as social studies standards, and she says that the organization is the key part. She also had a large number of academic experts who checked each standard for accuracy. I didn't notice any academic experts checking each revised standard. She said history as a discipline was the backbone. She said they also surveyed teachers, elementary and high school, to see what they wanted included. She drew on classicists, the Center for Middle Studies at Princeton, a Harvard professor checked the standards for the Europe and Middle Ages. She drew on the Center for Civics Education. She also drew on a historian at the Kennedy Memorial who has a PhD in Black history and slavery. That's the type of academic content that's in the Massachusetts standards. There's nothing like that I've seen in the South Dakota standards. So what can you do? First of all, we must oppose these standards. There's an opportunity for public comment that's still open. The first hearing will be next Monday. You can go on the Department of Education website and just say that you oppose the standards. You can say because they lend themselves to critical race theory, action civics, and you're opposed to that. You can attend the hearings. The first one is in Aberdeen on the 20th, and I don't know that they've set the others, but they will be probably every month through January. You can also make your comments known to your legislators and to the governor. And we do need to commend the governor for her 1776 pledge. It's a fabulous document. And also for the revisions that were made prior to the final release of the standards. That did correct some things. But you also need to let the governor know and your legislators know that while you appreciate those changes and you appreciate the pledge, that the standards don't meet those criteria because they're built on an action civics foundation and they'll allow for changes to come. And there's still code words and things like that are a little hard to detect, but they're there. So oftentimes I borrow this from Sarah Palin related to these standards. And you all remember what Sarah Palin said at the convention where she was elected to be the vice presidential candidate. She said, you can put lipstick on a pig, but it's still a pig. So you can put lipstick on these standards, but they're still bad standards. So when you're writing, the governor and your legislators insist that the current standard process be halted and the draft be scrapped, and they start completely over, and you demand that they have real experts and credible resources.